Gonna give it a couple more minutes here and let people trickle in before we get started. Give it about another minute. Pew, pew. All right, what's going on, everyone? Thanks for joining us for this month's Advanced Animation webinar. My name is Kareem Merchant. I'm one of the creative specialists here at Luxion. And in today's webinar, we have our global training specialist, Don Tuttle, who you may remember from our KeyShot 11 webinar. Don is one of the newest additions to the KeyShot team. He's already hit the ground running. Today, he's here to give you an in-depth look into all things animation and hopefully give everyone a solid base to work from when creating eye-catching and dynamic product visuals. But before we get started here, I wanted to put up some of our resources. If you have any questions about today's webinar and the KeyShot features discussed, feel free to reach out to myself at kareem@luxion.com or send questions and inquiries to our general info, support, and sales emails, which can be found on this slide as well as on our website, keyshot.com. If you're interested in staying up to date with the latest news, releases, and events at Luxion, you can find us through social on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And I also wanted to give a quick plug to our KeyShot 3D YouTube channel. Highly recommend checking it out. It's a great resource for KeyShot quick tips and tutorials for all our features, and it's consistently updated with new content. We also typically post higher res versions of our webinars there a day or two after airing, so keep an eye out for those as well. And lastly, before I hand it over, I also wanted to mention that Dawn is available for in-person training. If your team is interested in diving deeper into KeyShot and you're looking for a more tailored training experience, you can reach out to KeyShot Sales through the email on this slide, and we can get you taken care of. I'll also include that sales email in the description below for anyone interested in having Don come out. And on that note, I will pass it over to Don to introduce himself and jump into the nitty-gritty of animation in KeyShot.
Thanks, Kareem. Hello, everyone. My name is Don Tuttle. As we mentioned earlier, I am the global training specialist here at Luxion. I've been a 3D artist for 22 years, specializing in product rendering. I've been with Luxion for a short time, but I'm a long time KeyShot user. Let me share my screen real fast and we can get started. One thing I would like to mention before we actually get started is for everyone to go and check out Will Gibbons' KeyShot Animation Masterclass. If you have an opportunity, Will's a great guy. He really knows his stuff. I'd also like to mention that my PC specs are, I'm using an MSI Stealth GS77 with a Core i9, a 32 gigabytes of RAM, and an NVIDIA RTX 3080. We're going to be using a hammer drill today, and I'd like to give credit to Winston Jennings, and we were able to obtain the model from GrabCAD, so be sure to check that out. All right, let's get started. I think that it's a good idea to really touch on some best practices when it comes to animating. And what I mean by that is let's think about the assembly structure, the naming conventions, and even the scene units. As we look here at this hammer drill, you'll notice over in our model sets, we've got our main assembly here, but all of the parts contain the names of the colors that are on the materials you see on the model. And that really makes it hard to know what you're going to animate next. You have no idea what parts are which. So it's always a great idea to really think about the naming of your parts and your assemblies, because then you're going to have to get to the grouping portion of the animation. And so as you can see here, I've gone and set up all of my names so they're clear and easy to read, as well as easy to search for up here in the search portion of our scene structure. Now, thinking ahead, if you're doing an exploded animation, there's particular parts that you're going to want to have grouped in their own assemblies, whether that's this trigger area here. You need to have the what? Give me just a moment. Looks like I have lost my license. And it's typical to have some technical difficulties, even when you're best prepared. If you can give me just a moment, and we will get this all straightened out.
Apologies for the technical difficulties. We're going to get this situated real quick.
All right, looks like we're back and running. So thanks for being patient. There's always some kind of technical difficulties. Fortunately, I've got some good assistants here who can get me back on track. So as we were talking about before, it's important to have your parts of your assembly all named, something easy to really go through, identify quickly. And not only that, it's important to understand what kind of naming convention you want to use, especially if you're going to go and use your files outside in other animation programs, or you're animating in another program, and then you're going to bring it back into KeyShot and render within the KeyShot environment. Now, the big deal here is making sure that the names are structured in a way that's easy for the programs to communicate with one another. For example, a lot of the 3D programs don't like to have duplicate names, spaces within names, numbers at the beginning of the names. And the names I'm referring to include the part names, material names, assembly names. So as a best practice, a good way to structure your naming convention is to not have any spaces. If you're going to use a space, it's great to really utilize capital letters beyond that, or even having an extension here like ASM for assembly, which is telling the user, hey, I've got my handle assembly here. There's more parts than just a single part here and an assembly. So I'll generally go and select the areas that I plan on grouping together and create an assembly from those. For example, we've got this front, I'm just going to call it a front handle clasp and ring, but notice I don't have all the parts here. So I'm going to want to select the front handle right there, and then the front ruler, and that would all be an assembly. And the way that I'll go in is I'll end up selecting those, and then I will add the models to their own group like so. And I will call this front handle and then ASM. Okay, we'll continue. And here you can see that we've got that in its own group. And I can feel confident later on that when I go to animate this in an exploded view, it'll all move together. And really, you just want to go down and think about your animation beforehand. How do you want this grouped? It's really important, so you're not having to go back and redo your keyframes, restructure your model after you've already gotten really deep into the animation portion. That said, there's going to be times that you need to update your model even after you've gone through the entire animation. And that's why it's really important to focus on making sure that you've got your structure set up and your names are easily read, or easy to read, I should say. For example, if I had to update the front of my hammer drill, all I had to do was go in and do a search for front. And now it's only showing me parts of the model that have front in them. It's just a great way to be able to isolate your parts and make sure that you're able to update them quickly and easily. The next part of this, and something that really everybody needs to be cognitive of when working with KeyShot, and in a sense of working in groups or on teams, and which reminds me, that's really part of my workflow, is thinking about how this file is going to be used as an asset, perhaps later on. Perhaps I have a teammate that I'm modeling for, and my teammate's going to be the one that animates it. A lot of times you want to have these best practices and standards when working on a team, especially with multiple products and wanting to stay consistent throughout. So we've got our naming convention done. I've given an example of how to group the files in preparation for animating, and just really covered thinking about your scene. And I want to draw some attention here. This file is great. We've got it on our cloud library, but I want to draw your attention to the scale. And so every different 3D or CAD software is going to be in a particular scale or scene units. And a majority of the time when I've received CAD, it can be in millimeters, centimeters, sometimes it's in inches. And where this can cause some, I want to say roadblocks or obstacles, is when you're combining models that were done in different units. I personally like to stick with centimeters. But if I'm going to be animating and I want to also have models that were from another scene, I really like to make sure that my scale is set to 1. That can't always be the case. It's just not entirely possible, but as a best practice, I like to be sure that my scale is set to 1. So we've covered the assembly structure, our naming conventions, and then just thinking about our best practices moving forward, including the scene units. So in order to spare you all the time it takes to go in and structure these, I've got another scene that's prepped and ready to go so we can start moving forward with the animation portion. So I'm going to open up my my animation workspace. Go ahead and pull this up. So to begin, I'd like to touch on the animation, the camera animation specifically within KeyShot, and how well I think that they work for product animation specifically, whether it's an orbit or an exploded view. There's a lot of tricks that I've done in the past and other software that I just don't have to do within KeyShot because it's pretty much set up. And that if I wanted to do a orbit, it's already set there. In the past, I'd gone and maybe created a camera rig that would do something essentially the same way as the orbit does in here. And I really find that this saves a lot of time for prep and is just really a great way to get started and flesh out the camera animations. One of the things that I like to do, and I'll show you here, let me scale this up some, is I'll leverage locators. So I've created a model and it's somewhat in the shape of a cross. And I'll use this as my camera target in a way. And if you go over to your cameras, select that, you can see that we can set the camera target. For example, click that. And because this is underneath a parent group, as well as having these separate parts on it, I'm going to select this part setting, and then I'm just going to click there. And we're not seeing much of a change because it was already aligned there. But if I go to the camera settings and quickly adjust my azimuth, I'll give you kind of an idea of how it will rotate. And KeyShot, we can use the drill or any point on the drill to rotate around in this manner, but I'm kind of a visual guy. So I like to see and have a reference there. And that's where I find utilizing a locator is a very big help. So I'm going to turn that off though. I don't really want it to render along with the scene. I'm just going to click back. So I've got my Anycam 01 here. You can note that I'm using the best practice that I mentioned earlier. I don't have a space in here, but I did put in an underscore. To begin, what I wanted to show was a way of chaining these animations together. So I'll start out with an orbit and heyo. Bring up my animation window again, and we can quickly dock those windows. There we go. So I know that I'm going to start out with a 7-second animation. And what I want it to be is a seamless animation. So if I had it repeating, it would just simply continually orbit. And not only that, that end frame there would align with the beginning. That said, to make it perfectly seamless, we don't want to share that frame. So I would actually take it back. Whoops. Take my end frame back. So it's going to get to that point and stop. That's because on the very first frame, we're there. So if it looped, we're at that frame, and we wouldn't want this frame to match. So essentially, we wouldn't be rendering this particular frame here. And that would provide us with a seamless looped animation. And watching this kind of scrub through here, we are chugging a little bit. Let me bring up my HUD. I'm going to press H. And here I can kind of see my samples per second and how everything's running in there. But I think you all have the idea, and we can go ahead and move on to chaining this together and utilizing another camera animation alongside of it. So a lot of times when I've been given an animation project, I've generally been asked to utilize like a 360 animation, but I need to utilize the standard angles of the product, meaning typically there's a front right, a front left, a front facing product render. And when the client would request the animation, they would want these key angles to be set up. So I'm always cognitive of thinking about how the animation is going to be used later on and how I can match those particular standard angles. So here, this angle, I'd set it up previously. Fortunately, in my career, I've had an opportunity to work for some hardware manufacturers, and I understand what the look is they're going for. So I've created some standard angles to follow along with this animation. This one here being a front right facing camera angle. And then we'll bring it around. But what I'd like to see is as this orbits, we move into another camera angle. And the way that I'm going to do that is by chaining together another one of the camera settings here. So I'm going to right click and go into the animation, and then I've got my inclination here. And if you look over in the side here, in my geometry view, if you don't have that, hit O, and we can see we've got two cameras in here right now. But the one that we want to focus on, and let me see if I can hide this one real fast. We'll just delete it. Great. I'm going to show or turn off everything. There we go. So I've got the beginning of my camera there. I'm going to select that, and already we can see the motion of how the orbit is or I guess I should say the path of the camera orbit is shown by this red spiral. But you may also notice that we've got a little kind of arch in here. So if I go over to my inclination and bring it around, you'll notice that the two animations are overlapping one another so that they're working together. I don't want this inclination to go up 45 degrees. In fact, I want it to go down -45. So we get a top down kind of isometric front right view. And as it rotates or orbits around, we're going to go into a lower, almost a worm's eye view. And so what I'll do is get close to the frame where I think it should be. And then I'll kind of test out some numbers just to be sure that I'm on the right path. Sometimes we got to scrub back. I want it to be right about there, really. I think that that's lining up well with what I was picturing. I'm going to turn on my locator real fast, just kind of see how that's all lining up there. And as you can see, I'm still in the center, so I'm pleased with that. I am getting a little kind of a weird anomaly going on here where it does lose the pivot, but that's okay. I'm going to get it right to where I think it should be. And looking over in my geometry view again, you can see I've got a really pretty good round orbit there. I like the appearance of how round that is, and it speaks to what I mentioned previously with the camera orbits and how we've got these preset animations to start with. And seeing that, it makes me look, or it makes me think that it looks really nice as far as the motion is there. That said, we do have options for adjusting the motion around there. And as much as I want to jump into the motion ease right now, I think it's also a good practice to stick with your linear for the time being. And especially for this orbit, because I mentioned earlier that I wanted it to be seamless, having a linear ease is going to really help with that seamlessness. If we had a ease in or an ease out there, once it got to the part where it would loop, we would see that ease and it really wouldn't feel natural. So if you want to have a natural animation that's going to loop and repeat, you really want to keep it in a linear fashion. That's not to say you can't have an ease in or an ease out. I'm just saying if you want to make it easy on yourself, keep it on linear. That said, with the inclination, I'm not as concerned with the looping of it. The reason being is I'm not going to utilize the inclination all the way through the animation. In fact, what I want to do is mirror this. So I'm going to right click on the Anycamo 1 inclination, and I'm going to select mirror. And what that does is once I get to a certain point, the camera is then going to switch back to the previous angle. And let me just kind of nudge this over to really give you all a example. So as you see this coming around, I've got these linked together, and you can see I've got my pivot stays centered. We're able to bring it around and get that lower angle, and then bring it back up to the point that we started. So if I reset it, you'll notice that's my first frame. Here's my last frame, and they match pretty well. But like I mentioned earlier, we want to kind of bring it back just a frame, so it looks off just slightly to give you that seamless effect. I just scrub through it a couple of times, give you that feel. So I mentioned easing, and I think that we can go ahead and apply that to these inclination settings. So I'm going to push this in just a little bit, about 5 frames there, because I don't want the ease that I apply here to be recognized in that first frame. And so I'm going to do the same thing to the mirrored version. Just kind of bring it in some frames. And it's okay for that to be further along So then I'm going to go and I'm going to put an ease out on that one. And then I'll scrub through it and just kind of see how it appears. And on this one, I'm going to have an ease in set. So we can see the ease, we've got the orbit, and we've also got the animations chained together to provide us with an easy, simple orbit. So if you remember previously, I mentioned that at 7 seconds, we were looking to have this seamless. So I'm going to shorten the mirror. So we've got a nice 7-second animation. Let's see how it aligns. Great. Staying on my pivot. I know where my safe zone is, and we're all good to go. So we've covered our wizard chaining animations, and we've also looked at how to mirror an animation to make it relatively seamless and easy. I'm going to go ahead and open up the next step. And so we're going to get a little bit more involved now. Go ahead and dock my windows. Let's go to full screen. There we go. So as I've moved on into the animation, extend my timeline some. Come on. So as I scroll down here, you can see that I did add quite a bit of more camera animations as well as some of the part animations. And let's dive into that more so. I'm going to turn off my locators here. And let's go to our drill bit animation. So again, we're starting right here, going through, and it's at 7 seconds, but you'll also see that I've added on the part animations for the exploding view, as well as a few other settings with our animation cameras, including some depth of field and targeting. So we covered some of the animation portions for mirroring, but you can also copy the animations and duplicate them as well. One of the things that I'll typically do is find that movement that feels right, whether that's with the handle portion. So we've got the handle key right here. You can see that I've got these transforms assigned. And those are related to the mid portion of the hammer drill as well as the front. So you can see a lot of these are copied and mirrored, linked together. And then we have our handle translation and the fade that's on there. So looking at the handle group fade, as well as the front ring, and where's the key group? These are sharing the same fade. It's just copied my fade from here by right-clicking, copy animation, and then selecting the other assembly down here, which is the front key, and then just going to add animation and then paste. It's not accessible from there, but I think it's because I locked it. I'm gonna open up my next file real fast. Looks very similar. I know. It is essentially the same scene, but you'll notice that we've extended it a little bit. Reason being is we had the 7-second loop animation, but there's always going to be something a little bit more, and I like to be able to leverage as much as I can. So we're looking at one full, maybe extended length animation that is a exploded view along with some key feature shots put in there. So as I scrub through, you can see now I've got the camera is extending around and following another path. When I go up, you'll notice that I've got a few other cameras in here. And what I want to do as it's going through the timeline for our camera 1 is to have these switch events added. So this is our original 360 camera with the inclination applied, but then I've created some other ones here. And those would be the key feature or accessory shots that I mentioned previously. So looking at our animation camera 01, we're going to get up to about 7 seconds, which is right here for our looped animation. But then after the loop is done, I put in a camera switch event. And it's not entirely noticeable because I matched the end position of the camera with the next camera. And so we can think of this space in between as our transition. It's right in there. So as soon as I pass this keyframe here, I'm no longer on the animation camera. It's actually switched. And the way that you want to do a switch event is you'll go and you'll right click on the camera that you start with, and then you'll go down to your switch event and you can choose the next camera that you'd like to use. Just to illustrate it further, I'm going to go back. Then I'm going to select my camera 2, and you'll notice I should have named my camera 2. So let's do that real fast. So as I scrub through, you'll notice the camera's not moving, right? But the parts are. It's in the proper position, just like the camera 1. And it's not until we get past that 7-second mark that the camera 2 starts moving. Let's go back to camera 1. And so I hope that really illustrates that now we're in camera 2. But if you remember, let's go back. Camera 2 is extending all the way to the 12-second mark. But we are only seeing it for about a second, because at the 8-second mark, I've got another camera switch. Which goes to our drill bit camera. And you notice that when I select the drill bit camera, we can see that the animation frames for that one actually start at 7 seconds as well. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about this particular camera, but just to recap, from animation camera 1, we're able to go through the animation. It goes up. We've got a camera switch. It switches to Anycam 02. It moves over to the 8-second mark, and then we're going to switch to the drill bit camera. And then we're going to do another switch to a side camera, which is actually an orbit that was continuing previously up to that mark. So I mentioned I wanted to talk about the drill bit camera. So we'll select that. And you may notice we've got another one of those locators here. I'll unlock this. I've also got depth of field enabled. And you can see that the depth of field keyframe is here, and I've also got a mirrored version right there. And I also have a drill bit camera target right here. The drill bit camera target is our locator there. And you'll notice as it moves down, we can see it moving down the drill. And really, I had that there so I had a visual for my depth of field as it moves down the drill. And you can see we start out and it's a little blurred, but then as it progresses, it comes into focus until the closer portion is blurred. And then I was able to select the locator at this next angle and have more control, as well as some visuals on that. Well, let me pull this over a little bit so we can see what's going on here. We have our start focus distance. So if I scrub it back, we'd have the start here, and I can click that to select the focal point. You can see how it's set there, but then I would go and maybe adjust the f-stop to find the blur that I was looking for. Let me undo that. So then I would go, and I've got the mirror set up here. And this is not my complete animation. So there are some things in here that I have updated and done differently. But for this portion of the webinar, I'm just going to focus on that camera movement with the depth of field and as it travels down. The other portion, the other part that I animated here was the drill bit. So here you can see the drill bit locator that I've got set up, as well as the translation. And we have the front drill bit. And you can see that there's a rotation assigned to it, as well as these translations. And the translations come from that initial exploded view. Let me go back to that. So you can see the drill bit in that exploded view. And then as it rises up on that incline, and then we've got our camera switch, you can see that the drill bit starts rotating. I wanted to have that happen for continuity. We are doing a jump cut here, and yeah, we could have just rendered it out separate and then comped it in post, but you know, why not try to get everything done inside of KeyShot? Because it's a challenge, it's fun. So I got my jump cut here. The drill is going to start spinning up, and then I'll do the cut. The drill is already spinning at that point. I went ahead and utilized the motion blurs for the models and camera, partially because it looks cool. And the other reason was because I don't get to use it very much. So I thought it'd be fun. This was actually a really entertaining project to work on. It's not often that I can just kind of come up with stuff myself and kick it out. So it's been very cool. And so just like the drill bit, all of the parts really just have some simple translation animations on them. As I go through them, you'll notice they're all in linear. And like I mentioned previously, I think that as a best practice, it's always a great idea to stick with linear. But like I also mentioned too, we made those adjustments to the orbit and the inclination just to kind of smooth those out. I did end up adding it to the orbit after the fact. I had mentioned, you know, you want to keep it linear for that orbit to be seamless, but that it wasn't always the rule. Sometimes I'll just go in and I'll change my motion ease to custom, and that will bring up our tangents, showing us the ease in and the ease out. And really, this doesn't differ very much from the default setting. I just kind of go in there and kind of move it around. I like to refer to it as being, I'm humanizing it. I'm making it just a little bit not perfect. And it's just like a small tweak here and there, just to kind of break up the whole straight linear feel to it. If you haven't had an opportunity to get in and utilize the custom motion ease, I'm gonna really emphasize that you should get in there. Don't be intimidated by it. Learn it, love it, because ultimately it's going to give you more control over the fluid feel of the motion. It's also going to really make your animations stand out from the other animations people use, because these orbits and our standard animation tools in KeyShot are so nice and easy to use. They can appear a little canned. So a great way to differentiate your animations is to simply come in here and make some of these minor adjustments to your tangent handles. And if you're not familiar with working with these types of curves in a timeline, but let's just cover that real fast because I do think it's important. It wasn't really on the agenda, but I think that in an advanced animation webinar, we should really talk about tangents and locked tangents. And so here you have your two tangent handles. I'm just going to do a really quick high level view of this because I want people to know who haven't worked in here how this relates and not to be intimidated, because as soon as you start scrolling out, at least when I first started using animation curves, it was a little confusing for me to understand the graphs. And so if I can take a moment to talk about this, really, when you focus on this area here and you click it, you're all good for what we're doing here. Zooming out, don't be intimidated by how large that is. So be sure to always click the magnify or the zoom to fit, and you'll see your area of the timeline in here. You can note that this is going to be likely our 6-second mark, and I can actually scrub through this area here, and you can see it scrub through in the timeline as well. So this is just another way of looking at your timeline, and this is just another way of looking at your ease. In fact, this is a clearer picture than what you would know of when we use the ease in or ease out. So we've looked at setting up and chaining our standard camera animations, talked about setting up rotations and translations for parts, as well as looking at ways of utilizing these locators, whether it's for depth of field or your camera focus, your camera target. And you can see that we've got quite a bit of mirrored translations and fades. Just to touch on that a little bit more, you can see that a lot of these translations and mirrors, as well as the duplicates, they all have the same length of time. And maybe it's just me, but I like to keep things a little bit in sync because it helps with the overall pace. It's just feels more natural as it goes through. If I was to have a translation that differed a little bit, it may not feel right while it happens. But the way that I end up differentiating it is by just kind of adjusting the ends or the mirrored versions and the copies, and just kind of offsetting them a little bit to give them that little humanization, as I was referring to earlier. The fact that they've got the same length of time helps with the timing continuity, but kind of staggering them is going to help just break it up, make it not feel so symmetrical like these here. Now, why didn't I break these up, you ask? No reason. I think it just all looked fine there. So just to talk about the mindset, and what I was thinking is we approach this end frame. You'll notice that the handle fades out. And really it was just to give a full view of the product, kind of having that end view, right? You get this profile, you see the entire product there, company logo, maybe a word mark for the product. So bring it back some. Let's go ahead and go down and we can check out what else we have going on our depth of field 03. So again, let's scrub through it. You can see the exploded view, how it comes around. I'm going to come up and hit that 7-second mark. Now we've got a loop that we can leverage for later, but now it's going to kick into the second half. It's going to bring us around. We got a nice jump cut into the drill, and then we can continue the orbit back around. And if you remember, I selected my first camera here, and it's actually going through the other 3 cameras. Switch till it goes back. So open up my next scene here and talk about the environment animations. So as I've progressed through, I've got the animation to where I'm feeling like all of the keyframes are good. I may have adjusted some ease ins and ease outs, or even the timing here on some of them. Scroll down, take a look. And notice I locked some of these as well, just to be sure that didn't accidentally click on something. Again, I want to call your attention to the animation curves and note that I'm utilizing the linear for the depth of field. Again, it's mainly because it's not something that is clear to the end user. It's very subtle to begin with. But I do want to point out that on a lot of the end frame animations, or any animation that isn't looping, like those, will generally have either a custom ease or an ease out on it because it's not looping around. So as it ends, I think it's always a good idea to have that ease out, and vice versa. If it's inside an animation already and you're linking your animations together, it's good to have that ease in on them as well. So let's go over here, check out. I wanted to really kind of end the animation in somewhat of a dramatic way. And I also wanted to utilize the environment brightness animation. So one way of doing that is by duplicating my current animation, or my current environment, that is, just so I have that reference. I'm going to right click on it and then add animation. And you'll notice it's grayed out right now because I've already assigned it. So let's do it to this one. Go add animation, environment brightness. And you'll see down here, we've got environment brightness 2 has been added. The start gain is set to 1 and the end is at 0. So I'll give you a guess as what's going to happen as I go through it. The brightness is going to decrease. You may also notice that the background is stayed gray. And it wasn't until I'd gotten up to this point that I was like, you know, if I'm going to have the light fade, I may as well go on a black background. And black backgrounds are something that I never really get to render on. So I was a little excited to actually render on black. So gone and I've changed that. Let's go ahead and bring it back some. Totally changed the wrong color, but that's okay. It's okay. Now you can see how it fades out. And you may be asking yourself, but Don, I still see some highlights there. Yes, you do. There's still some highlights. That's because I've got a spotlight in the scene as well. I thought it was, it added to that drama, right? You know, it's the lights go down, but we still see a little bit of the product there. Another way that you could take this approach, let's say, as you're working through your animation, you get to a point where it's like, well, I cannot leverage this environment through my animation. Something, it gets blown out, let's say, or it needs to rotate in another direction. I think a great example is looking at these two environments that I set up. We have the basic one. This is what we've been working with throughout the videos thus far, except I changed the background to black, whereas this was the updated one. As I had gone through and prepped the files, you'll notice that the lights have shifted and moved around a little on the pins, that is. So if I hit U, we think about our studios. Another way that we could utilize different environments would be to set up different studios. So I've gone and I've got the animation that we were all pleased with. Everything's looking good until I get to that end frame. It's maybe a little bit too dark. So I'll select this, my main camera, the one that has the switch events assigned to it. I'm going to create a studio with that camera included. And with it selected, I can just scrub through and it's just as we expected. Let's take a look at the environment. Here we've got the first environment selected, and that's what's in there. So let's take a step back though and select the newer environment. And then I'm going to add another studio. I'll name this one End. And then this one Main. So our End studio has the adjusted environment on it. And so this is where it's kind of cool, in that you can have multiple environments in there. And then really this is the only thing that we're changing, is that environment. And we're going to change it at about, let's do it right as that camera switch happens, right? So about 10 seconds. Get back. So thinking that we're on our first studio, the main studio, with our initial environment. Now I'm going to animate it by creating an add studio switch event. And then I'm going to select End, which is the next studio in line. Right. So go through there and we're all good. And you can see that it gets to that endpoint. If I can just get it just right. Select the right camera. All right. Just to note, if you want to change your studio manually, you've got to disable your main. There we go. So scrub through it. Now we've got our main studio switch event. It's going to hit that 10-second mark, and we should have the new environment selected. Bring it back. And just to recap real fast, we've looked at the camera animations, gotten a quick overview of creating our exploded view, utilizing the translation fade animations. We touched on the drill bit rotation as well as locators, the ease in and out, utilizing animation curves. We've talked about doing the environment animation with the brightness and creating a studio switch as just an alternative way of switching out environment animations. In the complete version, I did not end up using the studio switch as I had in some of the preliminary animations that I had done here. So let's go on. We're going to open up our final chapter 6 with the entire completed animation. Hit stock my windows just to be safe. Go in presentation mode. Let's go and there we go. My first camera selected. Let's take it back. One thing I forgot to mention here was I've gone in and applied some of these here image styles. See, I've got some tone mapping. I'm using photographic just to kind of give you a little background there as to the bloom and the chromatic aberration that I just like so much. Underneath our lighting presets, I've set the GI bounces to 2 because I thought that the blue plastic could have used it. I am going to turn off this ground illumination because I do have a ground in there with a ground material assigned. And I've got ground illumination turned on in there. Not to mention, I've also turned down the ground size of the environment all the way. Reason being is, from what I remember, if your ground size, even if you're not using it with shadows, reflections, it's still being calculated. So it's always good to kind of save that CPU. And then we've got our basic environments in there as well. So as we scrub through here, bring it around, feeling okay with it. You can see I did make some adjustments with the drill itself. Thought it was more dynamic to have this type of a blur as well as I guess the angle, kind of the perspective that's there. It's not really poking you in the eye. It's just missing it. And then, coming into this end shot. One thing I am noticing though, is I come in here and I maybe didn't notice it previously, but the drill rotation could use a little ease out. So let's look at that. In fact, it comes kind of to a dead stop. Let's keep it going. Turn it up to 211. And just adjust it. I'm just going to bring it in, this handle to my end. Let's scrub through it and see how I wanted to slowly and almost as though it's like the ease is working alongside the environment. And one way to do that is we can come down here and check where's that environment changing, and then we can look at that rotation think about how much time is there on that wind down. So let's look at the curves there. Really wanted to maintain that speed, but not stop so abruptly. We don't have to have so much of an ease in as much as I get to slowly go out. Save that. Got a little fade to black. Check my agenda real fast, be sure we are on track. Looks like we're approaching an hour. So let's talk about frame rates. One of the great things about KeyShot is the ability to just change your frame rate and not have to adjust your timeline. Other 3D software, if you go in and you change your frame rate, a lot of times it's going to change all your keyframes. Things are going to shift and move. But here we've got a lot of freedom to come in and adjust the frame rate of your animations. And I want to talk a little bit about frame rates because something a little close to home with being a gamer. I love high frame rates in video games. For animations, not so much. I don't think that 60 frames per second on an animation is visually appealing. It looks a little fake. It just looks too smooth, too good. 30 frames, probably a nice balance. But for fun, I've actually been trying 24 frames a second. And I think that this is coming from the idea of cinematic kind of views. And what I've noticed is that running with a lower frame rate can really smooth a lot of keyframes out. Believe it or not, it's like the interpolation of those keyframes, having less to select from provides a smoother overall appearance. That said, I'm sticking with 30 frames a second. It is standard. And like I said, it is probably the great in between for rendering as far as time is involved, as well as aesthetics and how pleasing it is. One of the last things that I wanted to touch on here was previewing your animation and running through that, because we've scrubbed the timeline in here, we've worked all through it, and I feel like I've got a good idea of the motion that's there, and one of the reasons why, as I mentioned before, we want to keep our the keyframes themselves, the time that's in there for the animations equal, so it just kind of flows and it's got continuity. But we need to really preview it before doing that final animation. And if you're not aware, we have a preview animator down here. I just go, and since I'm looking at the samples, I could probably turn this down lower, and we won't run through the whole thing, but just to give you all an idea, I can hit preview here. It's going to judge it based on how many samples I denoted. And in this case, I said, hey, let's just go ahead and do 2 samples, because all we're doing is looking at the motion of the animation, just to see that everything looks right before we kick it off for a final animation. And a lot of times this is part of the process that I would do earlier when like setting up the cameras, working through the exploded view. But then I also always do it at the end when I'm ready to do that final animation, because this is going to give us that quick opportunity to look over the motion. We're going to see if anything maybe stands out. Maybe I forgot to turn off visibility of a locator, or the lighting adjustment that we've done isn't quite fitting in with the entire look. So that rendered relatively quick. Again, the samples were low, the resolution was low, and the graphics card I've got in this machine is awesome. So we were able to go and get a preview of the animation. I think the motion is smooth. It looks pretty good, especially on that. So if you remember key point, let me scrub it back some. All right. So we're about to hit our 7-second mark is in here, which is why I want to draw attention to it. This is where the looped animation would start. And if you remember, we talked about the linear versus the ease in on it. And this can be that moment where you can see that the loop is beginning or the initial animation is ending. So let me play it again and everybody watch to see how that motion is right about in here. So let it spin. Here it comes. Looked natural to me. So I'm rolling with it. It wasn't anything that stood out. I think that even if I wasn't looking for it, and maybe if you guys weren't looking for it, you may not have even known. Could have been kind of a continual move, but we're getting to that one mark that should match our first frame. So cool. I'm going to discard that. We've gone pretty much worked through a lot of this animation. I wish we could have done it all in real time, but I also, know that there's a lot of time constraints involved there. And sometimes I can just totally get off track and start tweaking something and notice that 30 minutes has gone by. So I hope you all have been able to at least follow along and understand some of the nuances that are there that I didn't dive too deep into, but I think the big takeaway is focusing on a different way of animating, maybe thinking about using locators or chaining together your other animations and even parenting them, whether that's linking the animations themselves, like I did with the fade animations. So I only had to change one fade setting if necessary. And finally, let's go down to that last render tab. How are you going to render this out? Do you want to have that video output? Are you going to render out your frames? Do you want TIFF, PNG, transparent background? It's normally how I go. That said, I also normally render on a white background. So I'm actually going to render on black and be okay with it. I will render a clown pass just in case. I think in a dark environment like this, I'm going to pass on the ambient occlusion pass. And it's likely that the 256 frames are going to work for this animation. And let's go one last thing. And we can call it a day if I can find. Way to be prepared, Don. Looks like cannot find the video I'm looking for, but of course I did find it now. So let's open that up. And we can look at the final animation. I was lucky we did some updates last night, and that is not the next animation I wanted to see. We can talk about these at the next animation webinar. Apologies. Did not know it was going to script through those. So let's open that back up. and we'll see if it loops or auto plays the next one. There we go. Cool. So updated this animation last night and rendered it out, and it rendered surprisingly fast for 256 samples on 300 and some frames on a laptop even. So yeah, final animation. Please reach out if you have any questions. Looking forward to the Q&A. And again, my name is Don Tuttle, Global Training Specialist here at Luxion, the makers of KeyShot.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. Tons of great information, and I appreciate you being here today. And thanks to everyone who made it. Appreciate you all being a part of today's webinar. At this point, I'm going to open it up for Q&A. If any of you guys have questions that you haven't asked so far, feel free to drop them in the chat box, and we'll try to get them over to Don to answer them. I mean, right off the bat, while we wait, I noticed on your cord for your drill, and there was a couple questions about it, that it actually faded out at the end there. And typically, cutaways, like a cutaway material on a piece of geometry, just creates a hard cutaway. So maybe you can explain to everyone how you managed to do that. I was thinking it was something along the lines of you using a gradient on your opacity input.
Nailed it. Yeah. Here, let's take a look at that. So yes, I did end up putting a gradient on the opacity. I did use spherical. If you remember before, I was talking about scale, and originally the scale of the drill was 0.1, and I did scale it up, which to a scale of 1. And that did affect the chord, so I had to go back and adjust it. But yeah, it's just a opacity, and I used a spherical on there. So if you want to have your stuff fade out, yeah, it's just kind of blocking in there. I've done the same thing to the ground plane as well. I go in, there's actually an opacity on the ground plane, so at some point it will fade off to the background while still keeping, your reflections and stuff.
Awesome. I'm not entirely sure if I understand this question. Let's see if you do. Somebody was asking about how you match two cameras, where you start with one camera and you're doing a 360 view, and then at the end you're matching the second camera to your 360 degree animation.
Yeah, super simple. Really just getting the camera around to that point, the one that you want to match. And so, like, for example, this camera, and then just hit it, and I've got my next camera there. And then I can continue on by adding on an orbit to that one. Then that way, when they're linked together, it's the end frame for this one is the beginning frame for that one. Does that make sense?
Yes, it did. And I noticed somebody was also mentioning animating exploding parts. We actually have a great exploding parts quick tip up on YouTube that Brooke Harrington did for us. If you guys are interested in learning about exploded animations, I would definitely give that a look. Maybe you can just give a brief answer, but in my past, whenever I've done exploded animations, I've always animated translations into the parts to actually create that.
Yeah, and really that's what I did here. I think that's the practice most of us do. I didn't dive into those as much because of time, and because I feel like that's the tradition, right? We're all going in, we've got our translations set up, and it's just, okay, explode out, let me mirror it to put it back in. That's why I was looking at touching on something a little bit more advanced here when thinking about chaining together the camera animations and leveraging locators and looking at depth of field and stuff. But otherwise, yeah, it's just a basic exploded animation with translations. As you can see here, a lot of mirrors. I liked the fade. I think that when you've got an orbit and you're also exploding parts, you don't want the parts to necessarily run into your camera. And on the preliminary animations that I had done, we could see the handle kind of coming in through the camera there. And it still does in some sense when I get to this point, but I adjusted the translation for this particular handle to be in front of the camera as opposed to this side handle when I came around this way was breaking through the camera at this point. So by putting the fade on there, I was able to hide it until it was at the appropriate time being in front of the camera like this here. And you can see that the fade is coming back as it moves in right there. So it's kind of like an off camera animation, just something that, you know, isn't entirely noticeable, but is there for aesthetics, really.
Awesome. Appreciate you kind of diving into that briefly. If there's no other questions coming in, maybe I'll give it a couple seconds here to see if anybody else has some animation related questions. But yeah, this has all been really, really great. We've covered a lot in this webinar, so it's going to be awesome having it posted up. We'll have a high res version, most likely by tomorrow. If you guys are having any issues seeing words that are kind of small on the screen, we'll get that situated. All right, well, I think it's about time to wrap things up. Just a reminder that we will be posting the webinar and the demo is kind of broken out into separate videos on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to jump over there if you're looking for more content in general. We have a bunch of different content. And also don't forget that Dawn is available for in-person training, which can be scheduled with one of our sales representatives through our sales email, which you can find in our resources slide or by checking the description below. I will put it there. And again, thank you, Dawn. It was great having you here today. Do you have any last words or parting thoughts for anyone?
No, not necessarily. Just be sure to check out Will Gibbons' Masterclass Animation. You'll probably get a lot of really deep, great information that maybe you were looking for in this particular webinar.
Yeah, Will's videos are always great.
They
all
are.
right. Well, on that note, thank you everyone for attending today. Hopefully you all have a spectacular rest of your day or night in many of your cases, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.